an interesting little piece of information that ties Muskoka development cottage-wise to the international scene. As late as the 1920s and 30s, I know a woman that could buy a return ticket from New Orleans to Cape Elizabeth. One ticket that would trains the whole way to the steamers that would drop at Cape Elizabeth.
If you look at some of the old steamer schedules, Cape Elizabeth is on there as a destination. You could buy a combination train and steamer ticket. Back when the steamer and the train had this close connection, you could ask to be dropped off at Cape Elizabeth. That does end in the 1920s, but there's also some great records of them ordering big shipments of coal and stuff too, right to Cape Elizabeth. They were a big place. Coate actually owned an auction house in Toronto, so he was a man of means. He was a man of means. He wasn't a poor guy at all. But Cape Elizabeth did become this really interesting, bustling area right just south of Rosso, and there are great journals at the Ontario Archives that span from about 1877 to about 1893 of this fellow writing his journal every day.
I noticed you were telling about the septic tanks and how they started back in those days, and I understand that a lot of the resorts had no way of filtering their sewage, and they used to just dump it right into the lake. Is that sort of true? Or?
Well, I haven't been able to find very much any documentary evidence to demonstrate that anything that resorts really did with their waste. There's a little bit of information I found about Summit House and how they separated out wastes. Back in the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, everything could either be composted or burned or put out in the middle of the lake without too much trouble. But human wastes in particular were definitely a problem for a lot, especially once resorts started getting running water. Then that became a significant problem. And I don't want to name any names, but there's still a resort I can think of off the top of my head that uses a fairly antiquated way of dealing with septic wastes in Muskoka. So we still have a ways to go before I think every septic system at the resorts in Muskoka are as good as they could be. Yeah.
I'm kind of curious why you didn't touch on boat building, particularly in the Gravenhurst area and so on, which had a significant impact as well.
Absolutely. I had to skip over an enormous amount of really interesting, not only spatially, like I concentrated on just places along the route, but I had to ignore really important parts of Muskoka's history in order to be succinct and to sort of take away some important messages. But yeah, boat building, absolutely. It had an amazing influence on Muskoka's economy. I'm not sure how much of a real impact on the shoreline we might be able to say that it had, but it certainly had a huge impact on the cultural imagination of what Muskoka is for people.
If the building didn't, the boats certainly did.
Right, yeah, and a lot of the boats that were being built in Muskoka too weren't even using trees necessarily from Muskoka. They were bringing in materials from far outside Muskoka. The earliest boats were all being built with materials from Muskoka, but once the industries started becoming really important, they started using materials that weren't even from Muskoka.
Good morning. There was also in Huntsville a very large tannery which operated until I think around 1956, and 3 men died.
Yeah, at least 3 men died. I'm sure more that died that we didn't know about.
Now, fairly recently, evidently the Ministry of the Environment, a lot of these things are still on the riverbanks around
the contaminants and things.
Yes, the arsenic and I think it was mercury and lead, and they can't do anything. So this is flowed down to Bracebridge. I used to cottage on the North Branch, drank the water, boiled it first, but anyway, and I've had environmental toxicity because of it.
Yeah. Wow.
But what about all this going on down into the lake? Can anything be done?
That's a good question. I'm not a scientist. I'm one of those boring historian types. So I can only tell you what things that I've been able to read from scientists who have been doing work on this. And to tell you the truth, I haven't been able to find anything that's been done on toxicity on the Muskoka River related to the tanneries. I would love, if there's anyone in the room certainly who can field that aspect, I'd love to hear about it as well, because I think that would really help out my own research to be able to say have some concrete discussion about what the lasting legacy of the tanneries are. Does anyone know of any studies that have been done
I only know I moved up here from Newmarket because of air pollution, and the area there had 7 tanneries over 200 years.
Right.
And so I had to move out of that area, and I cottaged up here. But the Aurora Banner published something about in Aurora, the same little branch of the river that flows up through Newmarket and into eventually Lake Simcoe. Well, they discovered these same things because there was a tannery in Aurora. Wherever these tanneries were, they left a legacy.
And I think if there's ever a possibility for taking a core sample out of the riverbed, I think that would probably provide some amazing information.
Well, they did it there, and I thought at one point the newspaper said there was going to be a survey of health of the people in the vicinity, but I think it was just left.
Any question here? Yeah, and then
I wasn't aware that the native peoples in this area grew potatoes. I thought it was corn, squash, and beans, which they refer to as the Three Sisters.
Yeah.
And are you familiar with Crawford Lake off Guelph
No,
Line?
I'm not.
It's a Merrimack lake. 2 such lakes exist in Canada, and it's very deep, very little water going in or out, which defines Merrimack Lake. But in the bottom of that lake, they found the pollen of those 3 crops.
Oh, I'm
which
sure.
I find is fascinating.
Absolutely, and that's one thing that's really important to keep in mind when we're talking about the Aboriginal peoples in this part of the world, is that they weren't just hunter-gatherers, they were farmers and horticulturalists as well. And potatoes is only something that they started growing into the 19th century, late 18th, 19th century, after potatoes became something that Europeans
They did
spread around.
in Central and South America grow potatoes.
Oh, absolutely, that's where potatoes come from.
Yeah.
Nancy.
Thank you. Andrew, it was interesting at the beginning of your talk when you were mentioning that a lot of the Aboriginal peoples sort of lived on the coastline in the summertime and then moved inland in the winter. That's opposite many things that I've heard and read. I'm sorry if you elucidate a little bit, because I've seen around Port Carling it was a summer spot when the fish would run, and a lot of the farming was in here. And I also thought along the coast of Georgian Bay would probably be a milder winter than it would have been inside for snow levels and things. So would you just explain that a bit more, please?
Sure, well, in terms of just the winter, living next to the shoreline in Georgian Bay in the winter can be pretty severe because of the wind and frost, and it provides colder temperatures in Georgian Bay.
But surely the lake levels would have kept it more of a maritime climate than a continental one?
Well, I don't have exact numbers to be able to reference, but once you move inland, you're definitely away from more of the severe winter storm effects. I mean, you still get a lot of snow, and it can certainly still be very cold, but the conditions, especially for people who didn't live in heated homes, would have been pretty severe. So they definitely avoided living along Georgian Bay. They moved into inland areas to stay through the winter time. Now, Muskoka, the idea of Aboriginal people, the Chippewa, the Sandy Island people, which eventually became the Wissahickon First Nations on Perry Island, they're an interesting case, because if you go back far enough into the beginning of the 19th century, all these First Nations that I mentioned were more or less a sort of coherent unit to a certain extent under Chief Muskoka, who fought with the British in the War of 1812. But as pressures were put on the Aboriginal people in this region to cede their land so that white people could come and settle it, these bands almost strategically decide to split up, so that it becomes hard for the Crown to govern them. Some of them go to stay at Rama. For a while, there's a settlement at Coldwater. The government tried to get them to become farmers and sort of civilize them. And they resisted this, and they sort of ended up splitting up. The one group bought a whole bunch of land at Rama. Another group went out to Beausoleil Island, and then eventually to Christian Island. Another group went to Georgina Island at Lake Simcoe. And one group, sort of a branch group of the Rama group, called the Sandy Island Indians, went and lived in Muskoka. And the image that we have of the Aboriginal people living year-round in Muskoka, at Port Carling, and on Tobin Island, for example, are, to my knowledge, and this is as far as I've been able to look at it, an outcome of this early 19th century breakup of a more coherent group under Muskoka. There's not a lot of evidence of people living year-round the way they did around 1850, 1860, and into the 1870s of the groups that live now, or that were living in Port Carling or Tobin Island year-round. I see a head shaking though.
Don't think they lived in Port Carling.
Not year-round.
Not year-round.
Not year-round, but they did spend time there. So what I mean by year-round is that they spent time in both the summer, the fall, the spring, the winter. There was a more flexible arrangement by which people lived in Port Carling at different times of the year. They would leave and come back, certainly, but by the 1850s, 1860s, the Aboriginal people in South Central Ontario weren't following the same patterns that they did that I outlined here, which was at the very beginning, first half of the 19th century. That becomes disrupted. So from what I can tell, there's a window of about 20 or 30 years where the Sandy Island Indians both live in Muskoka as a sort of a refuge to try to avoid governance, and spend time over at Perry Island and Perry Sound area.
Can you expand or be a bit more specific about the indigenous ways, people's ways that we can learn from that you're talking about?
Absolutely. Well, I think now we're not going to be developing or instituting systems of being in Muskoka where we all leave for part of the year. But I think this issue of realizing that human beings can't get everything we need from Muskoka is important to pay attention to. That we do rely on extensively, living on the Shield, we really do rely extensively on inputs from outside the area. This is unavoidable if we're going to live in Muskoka, but what we can do to make life in Muskoka more sustainable, and I think which one of the important lessons that Aboriginal people and their history in Muskoka can teach us, is that we really do need to learn how to utilize the resources that we do have in Muskoka to its utmost. Muskoka can grow food. We can eat the food that people grow in Muskoka. I think there needs to be some ways developed and strategies pursued to make it possible for people who live in Muskoka year-round to think a little bit more sustainably about what resources we can rely on a little bit more extensively living in Muskoka year-round, and to be cognizant of the kinds of things that we are reliant, that we bring in from elsewhere. Aboriginal peoples didn't bring very much in with them in order to live in Muskoka. They left Muskoka when it suited them to go down to either to trade or for the spring fish runs or the fall fish runs. So I think it's important to remember that Aboriginal peoples didn't live in Muskoka year-round for a very important reason that we can't ignore. And we need to think about why that is and how that should shape the way that we acquire and consume resources in Muskoka as well.
One last one from
Yes, your talk is excellent. I was wondering in your research if you found any evidence of records keeping from the Aboriginal people on changes in climate and how it affected their sort of migration?
Having talked with a few elders at Wissahickon First Nation, they do have some inherent community knowledge about climate issues. There isn't anything written down that I've got. Most of the sources, sadly, are sources most of them are sources between Aboriginal communities and the government and the Crown over land claims issues in particular. And very rarely is the government asking very much information about environmental conditions apart from, you know, the scarcity of deer and that kind of thing. Sadly, there isn't much out there, but as much as the Aboriginal people are a good source to go and talk to for that kind of thing from their sort of their oral traditions, there are good ways to get climate history from Muskoka. Dendrochronology is a fantastic way. Some of the oldest trees are going to have very important information that goes back 600, 700 years, as well as lake bottom sediment core sampling too.
Okay, one last question now.
One last
Over here.
I'm just curious whether you deal very much in your thesis with the impact of the Booth Railway on the. I know it had an impact.
Judy mentioned Judy mentioned that I'm working on my last couple of chapters, and they are my industry chapters. So I'm looking at the logging and tanning industries this spring and summer, and that will be the last bit of my research to do. And yeah, I hope to give a good wide swath at the lumber interests in Muskoka, definitely. Sorry, I can't say more about that.
Okay.